Let me say a couple of words about the title, which as always is shorthand. There's too much nuance and variety to make any sharp distinction between us and them. And of course, neither I nor anyone else can presume to speak for us, but I'll pretend it's possible. There's also a problem about the word crisis. Which one do we have in mind? There are numerous very severe crises. Many of them will be under discussion here in a couple of weeks at the United Nations and their conference on the world financial and economic crisis. And these crises are interwoven in very complex ways which make it, which preclude any sharp separation. But again, I'll pretend otherwise for simplicity. Well, one way to enter this morass was helpfully provided by a current issue of the New York Review, dated yesterday. The front cover headline reads, "How to Deal with the Crisis." It features a symposium of specialists. That's worth reading, but with attention to the definite article, "The Crisis." For the West, the phrase "the crisis" has a clear enough meaning. It's the financial crisis that hit the rich countries and therefore is of supreme importance. But in fact, even for the rich and privileged, that's by no means the only crisis or even the most severe of those they face, and others see the world quite differently. For example, the newspaper New Nation in Bangladesh. There we read, "It's very telling that trillions have already been spent to patch up leading world financial institutions, while out of the comparatively small sum of $12 billion pledged in Rome earlier this year to offset the food crisis, only $1 billion has been delivered. The hope that at least extreme poverty can be eradicated by the end of 2015, as stipulated in the UN's Millennium Development Goals, seems as unrealistic as ever, not due to lack of resources, but to a lack of true concern for the world's poor." They're talking about approximately 1 billion people facing starvation, severe malnutrition, even 30, 40 million of them in the richest country in the world. That's a real crisis, and it's getting much worse. In this morning's Financial Times, British business press, it's reported that the World Food Program just announced that they're cutting food aid and rations and also closing operations. The reason is that the donor countries have been cutting back funding because of the fiscal crunch, and they're slashing contributions. So there's a very close connection between the horrendous food crisis and poverty crisis and the significant but less significant fiscal crisis. They're ending up closing down operations in Rwanda, and Uganda, Ethiopia, many others. They have to 20 to 25% cut in budget, while food prices are rising, and the financial crisis, the general economic crisis, is bringing unemployment and cutting back remittances. That's a major crisis. We might incidentally remember that when the British landed in what's now Bangladesh, they were stunned by its wealth and splendor, and it didn't take long for it to be on its way to become the very symbol of misery, not by an act of God. Well, the fate of Bangladesh should remind us that the terrible food crisis is not just a result of Western lack of concern. In large part, it results from very definite and clear concerns of the global managers, namely for their own welfare. It's always well to keep in mind an astute observation by Adam Smith about policy formation in England, he recognized that what he called the principal architects of policy, in his day the merchants and manufacturers, make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England, but far more so those who were subjected to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, and particularly in conquered India, his own prime concern. We can easily think of analogs today. His observation, in fact, is one of the few solid and enduring principles of international and domestic affairs, well, to keep in mind. And the food crisis is a case in point. It erupted first and most dramatically in Haiti in early 2008. Like Bangladesh, Haiti is a symbol of utter misery. And like Bangladesh, when the European explorers arrived, they were stunned because it was so remarkably rich in resources. Later it became the source of much of France's wealth. I'm not going to run through the sordid history, it's worth knowing, but the current food crisis traces back directly to Woodrow Wilson's invasion of Haiti, which was murderous and brutal and destructive. Among Wilson's many crimes was to dissolve the Haitian parliament at gunpoint because it refused to pass what was called progressive legislation, which would allow U.S. businesses to take over Haitian lands. Wilson's Marines then ran a free election in which the legislation was passed by 99.9% of the vote. That's of the 5% of the population permitted to vote. All of this comes down to us as what's called Wilsonian idealism. Later, U.S. aid instituted programs in Haiti to turn it under the slogan of turning Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean by adhering to the sacred principle of comparative advantage. That is, they should import from the United States while working people, mostly women, slaved under miserable conditions in U.S.-owned assembly plants. Haiti's first free election in 1990 threatened these economically rational programs. The poor majority made the mistake of entering the political arena and electing their own candidate, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a populist priest. And Washington instantly adopted standard operating procedures, moving at once to undermine the regime. A couple of months later came the military coup, instituting a horrible reign of terror, which was backed by Bush. Bush won, and even more so by Clinton. By 1994, Clinton decided that the population was sufficiently intimidated, and he sent U.S. forces to restore the elected president. That's now called a humanitarian intervention, but on very strict conditions, namely that the president accept a very harsh neoliberal regime, in particular, no protection for the economy. Haitian rice farmers are quite efficient, but they can't compete with U.S. agribusiness that relies on a huge government subsidy, thanks to Ronald Reagan's free market enthusiasms. Well, there's nothing at all surprising about what followed next. In 1995, U.S. aid wrote a report pointing out, I'm quoting it, that the export-driven trade and investment policy that Washington mandated will relentlessly squeeze the domestic rice farmer. In fact, the neoliberal policies rammed down Haiti's throat, dismantled what was left of economic sovereignty, drove the country into chaos, and that was accelerated by Bush #2's banning of international aid on totally cynical grounds. In February 2004, the two traditional torturers of Haiti, France and the United States, combined to back a military coup and send President Aristide off to Africa. The U.S. denies him permission to return to the entire region. Haiti had by then lost the capacity to feed itself, making it highly vulnerable to food price fluctuation. That was the immediate cause of the 2008 food crisis, which led to riots and enormous protests, but not getting food. The story is familiar, in fact, quite similar in much of the world. So going back to the Bangladesh newspaper, it's true enough that the food crisis results from a Western lack of concern. A pittance by our standards would overcome its worst immediate effects. But more fundamentally, it results from the dedication to Adam Smith's principles of business-run state policy. These are all matters that we too easily evade. They happen daily, along with the fact that bailing out banks is not uppermost in the minds of the billion people now facing starvation, not forgetting the tens of millions enduring hunger in the richest country in the world. Well, also sidelined as an easy way to make a significant dent in the financial and the food crises. It's suggested by the publication a couple of days ago of the authoritative annual report on military spending by SIPRI, the Swedish Peace Research Institute. The scale of military spending is phenomenal, regularly increasing this last year as well. The U.S. is responsible for almost as much as the rest of the world combined, 7 times as much as its nearest rival, China. No need to waste time commenting. This distribution of concerns reflects another crisis here, kind of a cultural crisis. That is the tendency to focus on short-term parochial gains. That's a core element of our socioeconomic institutions and the ideological support system on which they rest. One example, now prominent, is the array of perverse incentives that are devised for corporate managers to enrich themselves. For example, what's called the too big to fail insurance policies that are provided by the unwitting public, and deeper ones. They're just inherent in market inefficiencies. One such inefficiency, now recognized to be one of the roots of the financial crisis, is the underpricing of systemic risk, the risk that affects the whole system. So, for example, and that's general, like if you and I make a transaction, say you sell me a car, we may make a good deal for ourselves, but we don't price into that transaction the cost to others. And there's a cost. Pollution, congestion, raising the price of gas, all sorts of other things. Killing people in Nigeria because we're getting the gas from them. That doesn't count when we don't count that in. That's an inherent market inefficiency, one of the reasons why markets can't work. And when you turn to the financial institutions, it can get quite serious. So it means that, say, Goldman Sachs, if they're managed properly, if they make a risky loan, they calculate the potential cost to themselves if the loan goes bad. But they simply don't calculate the impact on the whole financial system. And we now see how severe that can be. Not that it's anything new. In fact, this inherent deficiency of markets, this inefficiency of markets is perfectly well known. 10 years ago, at the height of the euphoria about efficient markets, 2 prominent economists, John Eatwell and Lance Taylor, they wrote an important book called Global Finance at Risk, in which they spelled out the consequences of these market inefficiencies, which we now see, and they outlined means to deal with them. These proposals were exactly contrary to the deregulatory rage that was then being carried forward by the Clinton administration under the leadership of those who Obama has now called upon to put band-aids on the disaster that they helped create. Well, in substantial measure, the food crisis plaguing much of the South and the financial crisis of the North have common roots, namely the shift towards neoliberalism since the 1970s. That brought to an end the post-war, post-Second World War Bretton Woods system that was instituted by the United States and Britain right after World War II. It had two architects, John Maynard Keynes of Britain and Harry Dexter White in the United States, and they anticipated that its core principles, which included capital controls and regulated currencies, they anticipated that these principles would lead to relatively balanced economic growth and would also free governments to institute the social democratic programs, welfare state programs, that had enormous public support around the world. And to a large extent, they were vindicated on both counts. In fact, many economists call the years that followed until the 1970s the golden age of capitalism. That golden age led not only to unprecedented and relatively egalitarian growth, but also the introduction of welfare state measures. Keynes and White were perfectly well aware that free capital movement and speculation inhibit these options. Professional economics literature points out, what should be obvious, that the free flow of capital creates what they sometimes call a virtual senate of lenders and investors who carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies, and if they find that they're irrational, meaning they help people instead of profits, then they vote against them by capital flight, by tax on the country, and so on. So the democratic governments have a dual constituency, their own population and the virtual Senate, who typically prevail. And for the poor, that means regular disaster. In fact, one of the reasons for the radical difference between Latin America and East Asia in the last half century is that Latin America didn't control capital flight. In fact, in general, the rich in Latin America don't have responsibilities. Capital flight approximated the crushing debt. In contrast, during South Korea's remarkable growth period, capital flight was not only banned, but could bring the death penalty, one of many factors that led to the surprising divergence. Latin America has much richer resources. You'd expect it to be far more advanced than East Asia, but it had the disadvantage of being under imperialist wings. From the 1970s, the golden age faded when neoliberal rules were observed, insofar as they've been observed. Economic performance deteriorated. Wages for the majority of the population have stagnated. Up till then, they essentially tracked growth. Work hours have increased, now well beyond Europe. Benefits, which have always lagged, have declined. Social indicators, kind of general measure of the health of a society, they also tracked growth until the mid-1970s, when they began to decline, reaching the 1960 level by the end of the millennium. Well, there has been economic growth, but it's finding its way into very few pockets, increasingly into the financial industries, which have grown enormously, while productive industry has significantly declined. We're seeing it right now. And with the decline of productive industry, of course, that means decline in living standards, in fact, even opportunities to survive for much of the workforce. The economy has also been punctuated by bubbles, financial crises, and public bailouts. So the huge bailout of Citigroup right now is nothing new. Something quite similar happened in the early 80s to its predecessor, Citibank, thanks to the U.S. taxpayer. These results were described right all through this period and explained by a few really outstanding international economists. David Felix is one. But the mythology about efficient markets and rational choice prevailed. And that's not at all surprising. These myths were highly beneficial to very narrow sectors of privilege and power, what Adam Smith called the principal architects of policy. That's another very severe institutional and cultural crisis which persists. Now, actually, the phrase golden age of capitalism is a little misleading. It might more accurately be called state capitalism. It's worth bearing in mind that the dynamic state sector was and remains a primary factor in development and innovation through a variety of measures, research and development, procurement, government procurement, public subsidy, regular bailouts, and other means. That's particularly true in the United States. It was done here under a Pentagon cover as long as the cutting edge of high-tech industry, advanced economy, was electronics-based. For that, the Pentagon served as a good cover. In recent years, if you look at government spending, it's shifting more towards the health-oriented institutions of the government. That's a reflection of the fact that the cutting edge of the economy is becoming more biology-based. That includes computers, the internet, satellites, most of the rest of the IT revolution that finally exploded in the late 90s in a tech bubble, but also much else, civilian aircraft, advanced machine tools, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and a lot more. The crucial role of the state in economic development should be kept in mind when we read these days dire warnings about government intervention in the financial system after private management has once again driven it to ruins. This time an unusually severe crisis, and one that harms the rich, not just the poor, so it merits special concern. It's also worth recalling that large-scale state intervention in the economy is nothing new. On the contrary, it's always been a central factor in economic development. It's a matter, I wish I had time there's no time to review it here, but the history, which I'll skip, is quite instructive. These state-guided modes of economic development require considerable deceit in a society where the public can't be controlled by force. So people can't be told that the advanced economy relies heavily on the principle that the population pays the costs and takes the risks, and that the profit is eventually privatized. And eventual can be a long time, sometimes decades, as in the case of computers and the internet, for example. After World War II, Americans were told that their taxes were going to support defense against monsters about to overcome us. That's why I was under a Pentagon cover. So, for example, in the mid-'60s, when LBJ warned that there are only 150 million of us, and there are 3 billion of them, and if might makes right, they're going to sweep over us and take what we have, so we have to stop them in Vietnam. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. For those who are concerned to understand the realities of the whole Cold War system of control of the public, there's a very obvious moment to inspect carefully. That's just 20 years ago, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and what followed later. Now, this celebration of the 20th anniversary this November, it's already begun with ample coverage, and it's surely going to increase as the date approaches. But the very revealing policy implications of what followed have been ignored, as in the past, and probably this coming November, except on Democracy Now. What happened after the Berlin Wall fell? Well, the Bush 1 administration reacted immediately. It issued a new national security strategy and a budget proposal, which has laid out what our new course will be after the collapse of what Kennedy called the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy to conquer the world, Reagan's evil empire. It was gone. And now that it was gone, the whole framework of propaganda collapsed. So what was the response of the planners in the Bush administration? Very straightforward. In brief, everything will go on exactly as before, but with new pretexts. So we still need the same huge military system, but for a new reason. Literally, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Nobody laughed. We have to maintain what they called the defense industrial base. It's a standard euphemism for high-tech industry, the system whereby the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and high-tech industry gets the profits. We also have to maintain intervention forces directed mostly at the Middle East. And then comes this interesting phrase, directed at the Middle East, where the threats to our interests that required military intervention could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, sorry folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now the clouds have lifted so you can see if you choose to, and few chose to. Actually, the fate of NATO is very instructive and highly pertinent right now. Prior to Gorbachev, NATO's announced purpose was to deter a Russian invasion of Europe. That was often a little hard to take seriously. For example, in 1945, in May 1945, Winston Churchill ordered war plans to be drawn up for what they called Operation Unthinkable. It was aimed at, quote, the elimination of Russia. The plans, which were declassified 10 years ago, I'll quote it, called for a surprise attack by hundreds of thousands of British and American troops, joined by 100,000 rearmed German soldiers, while the RAF, British Air Force, would attack Soviet cities from bases in northern Europe. And pretty soon nuclear weapons were added to the mix. All of this was declassified 10 years ago. Well, the official stand also wasn't very easy to take about 10 years later when Khrushchev took over in Russia. And he very soon proposed a very sharp mutual reduction in offensive military weaponry. He understood very well that the much weaker Soviet economy couldn't possibly sustain an arms race with the United States and still hope to develop. Well, when the U.S. dismissed the offer, as it did, he carried out the reduction unilaterally. And Kennedy did react to that. He reacted with a very sharp increase in military spending, which the Russian military later tried to match. That's tanking the economy, as Khrushchev had anticipated. Actually, that was the crucial moment in the Soviet collapse. It's kind of economy stagnated since then. Well, whatever one thinks of the defensive pretext for NATO, at least had some credibility. But what happens when the Soviet Union is gone and the pretext disappears? Well, it got more extreme. Gorbachev made an astonishing concession. He permitted a unified Germany to join a hostile military alliance run by the global superpower. That is astonishing in the light of history. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice in the century. Now, there was a quid pro quo. This is Bush #1 and James Baker. It had been thought up until a couple of months ago that Bush and Baker promised not to expand NATO to the Eastern European former Soviet satellites. But there was the first careful study of the original documents just came out by Mark Kramer, Cold War historian. He believes that he's refuting charges of U.S. duplicity. But in fact, what he shows is that it's much more cynical than what had been assumed. It turns out that Bush and Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't even fully extend to East Germany. Quote them, they told Gorbachev no NATO forces would ever be deployed on the territory of the former German GDR, East Germany. NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward. They also assured Gorbachev that NATO would be transforming itself into a more political organization. Well, there's no need to comment on that promise, but what follows tells us a lot more about the Cold War and its aftermath. Right after that, Clinton came into office. And one of the first things he did was to begin the expansion of NATO to the east, in radical violation of the commitment. Process accelerated with Bush's general aggressive militarism. Russia, these are severe security threat to Russia. It naturally reacted by developing more offensive military capacity. All of this is a serious threat to human survival. Obama's national security advisor, James Jones, he has a still more expansive conception. He calls for expanding NATO further to the east and the south, becoming in effect a U.S.-run global intervention force, as it is today in Afghanistan. The Secretary General of NATO, Dutch officer De Hoop Scheffer, he informed the NATO meeting that NATO troops have to guard pipelines that transport oil and gas that's directed for the West. And more generally, NATO has to protect sea routes used by tankers and other crucial infrastructure of the global energy system. All of that just opens up a new phase of Western imperial domination. Actually, the polite term for it is bringing stability and peace. That's what's happening now.